Well, it's been a very nice conference. So our closing keynote speaker is Dr. Pachauri. Dr. Pachauri is a Nobel laureate. Yay. Chairman of the IPCC, that you are, for sure, and the founding director of the YCEI. He's also Director General of the Energy and Resources Institute. I mean, come on, you know. His efforts and work with the IPCC has focused the world's attention on the severity of man-made climate change, and he's really provided the critical scientific information necessary for our leaders and our policymakers to make the informed and mature decisions that ultimately would benefit everyone if they're willing to take that path. So please, let me just introduce Dr. Pachauri, and let's all welcome him.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. I have about 30 minutes in which I'm going to make a PowerPoint presentation to you, and I don't know if there'll be time for questions and answers, but I'll try to make it a bit shorter so that at least you have a few minutes to ask any critical questions that you have in mind. I'll start with the first slide, and this, of course, is at the heart of what climate change is all about. There have been scientists going back 150 years who have been telling us about the consequences of increase in carbon dioxide concentration in the Earth's atmosphere in terms of change in climate. But I think for a long period of time, the world sort of ignored them. And therefore, I think we were really living in a state of ignorance, and we caused a problem which is very well expressed in this brief quotation from Albert Einstein. Just to give you an indication of what's been happening with emissions of greenhouse gases, and I'll say a lot more later on, you know, since 1970 up to 2010, the emissions that have taken place constitute 50% of the total emissions since the beginning of industrialization. So in a sense, not only have we ignored knowledge, and not only has our awareness been deficient, but it's actually, in some sense, become even worse. Let me go on to why I'm saying so. You know, there's a 95% certainty that human influence has been the dominant cause of observed warming since the mid-20th century. We use the term extremely likely that this statement is correct, and when we talk about extremely likely, we are assigning a probability of over 95%. In the previous assessment report, that's the fourth assessment report, we used the term very likely, which represented a probability of over 90%. So this is where I would say our understanding, our knowledge, and our confidence in the findings that we have come up with in the past has certainly increased substantially. And since the mid-1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. So in a short period of time, obviously we have had much to do that really pales into insignificance what has happened over millennia. And limiting climate change will require sustained and substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and I'll say more on that. Now, each of the last 3 decades has been successively warmer at the Earth's surface than any preceding decade since 1850. And about a month ago, the World Meteorological Organization has come out with a major statement. They bring this out annually, which mentions, as a matter of fact, that 2011 tied with 2006 as the warmest year since records have been maintained. Oceans have warmed and risen, the amounts of snow and ice have diminished, sea level has risen, and the concentrations of GHGs have increased. Now, as it happens, ocean warming dominates the increase in energy stored in the climate system. More than 90% of energy accumulated between 1971 and 2010 is accounted for with the increase in heat in the oceans. So in a sense, this has been a moderating influence. Otherwise, surface temperatures would have been substantially higher. And the rate of sea level rise since the mid-19th century has been larger than the mean rate during the previous 2 millennia. And between 1901 and 2010, the global mean sea level rose by 19 centimeters. Now that's pretty close to a foot. And here, may I say that it's not the fact that large parts of the world are being inundated, but even before that happens, storm surges, coastal flooding are going to play havoc into several parts of the world. You take another example. This is something on which I was criticized for because people twist things around. We had this terrible tsunami in Japan. If the sea level had been lower, let's say where it was over 100 years ago, the extent of damage and devastation would have been much less. Because the higher the sea level, the greater would be the damage with any of these events, no matter what the cause might be. And of course, there are some motivated people in the media who said that the chairman of the IPCC says that the tsunami was caused by climate change. But that's good reporting, so I won't say. I mean, it makes headlines. Okay, the atmospheric concentrations of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide have increased to levels unprecedented in at least the past 800,000 years. And in the previous report, we had assigned a figure of 650,000 years, but now we are absolutely certain that these levels have not occurred for 800,000 years. And the oceans, of course, are acidifying at a very rapid rate because 30% of the emitted anthropogenic carbon dioxide has been absorbed by the oceans. And frankly, this is an area in which enough research has been not conducted so far. So we really don't know what the impacts would be on marine ecosystems, on marine species. We do know that it's affecting coral reefs in a harmful way, but there's a lot more to be done in this area. And CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, combustion, and industrial processes contributed about 78% of the total GHG emissions increase from 1970 to 2010. So about 78% of the emissions from these two sets of sources has been accounted for by these particular sources of emissions. This is just a quick picture, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. But the one thing that I'd like to point out for your information is the agriculture, forestry, and land use related emissions. Now, one of the things that we've done, and I'll mention this a little later, in the Working Group 3 report that was brought out a week ago, is to highlight the importance of this particular sector really being able to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. I mean, thus far, people have only concentrated on established industrial, energy-related, transport, and other sources of emissions. But this is also a major source where we need to bring about some major changes. Oceans, we know, will continue to warm during the 21st century, and you have to accept the fact that there is an enormous amount of inertia in the whole system, quite apart from the fact that we have inertia in our minds as well. We don't change easily, but there's a lot of infrastructure, there are processes, there are technologies that are geared to use of conventional forms of energy supply that use all kinds of resources in a particular manner, and all of this will have to change. But there's always a set of barriers to change. There are always delays, and therefore you would say that there is an inertia. And it's very likely that the Arctic sea ice cover will continue to shrink, And then as global mean surface temperature rises, and I'll be going there again. I've been to the Arctic region a few times. I'm going there again at the end of next month. Global glacier volume will further decrease. Global mean sea level will continue to rise during the 21st century, and I'll give you some numbers on that. The other point that I'd like to make is that climate change is not a slow, smooth, and steady system. Climate change is going to be being accompanied by a whole set of extreme events. It's very likely that the length, frequency, as well as intensity of warm spells or heat waves will increase over most land areas. And in fact, we've got certain scenarios under which we've assessed that, let's say, a 1 in 20-year hottest day is likely to become a 1 in 2-year event in most regions if we don't mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases. It's also likely that the frequency of heavy precipitation or the proportion of total rainfall from heavy falls will increase over many areas of the globe. In fact, so much so that in those parts of the world where you have a decline in average precipitation, a large part of it will take place in the form of heavy falls. So these are things which not only pose hazards for life and property, but they also have major implications on the availability and accessibility of water resources. These are just some quick tabulations of impacts that I wanted to bring to your attention. Freshwater resources, there would be a reduction of surface as well as groundwater resources in many dry subtropical regions. And climate change is projected to pose risks to raw and drinking water quality, because what's also happening at the same time is that the quality of water is being affected, but once the volumes decrease, then clearly the concentration of pollution in a lot of this stock is also going to increase correspondingly. Increased extinction risk under all warming scenarios as far as freshwater ecosystems are concerned. Increased tree mortality, forest dieback with risks for carbon storage, submergence and coastal flooding, which I mentioned a while ago. Marine systems, there will be a redistribution and reduction of global marine species. I'll just give you an example, and this is purely anecdotal. I mean, the last time I went to the Maldive Islands, which incidentally have been a major exporter of tuna fish, they mentioned that the stock of tuna that they were accustomed to is just not available anymore, because a lot of that fish has moved to other areas which are now less warm than that surrounding area. And this is happening with a number of species. In fact, in the Working Group 2 report, we've got a diagram which shows the speed of migration of different sets of species. These are both plant as well as animal species that are moving, not to speak of marine species. Expansion of dead zones will take place with constraints for fish habitat, and polar ecosystems and coral reefs are at substantial risk. Food security and production systems, these are going to be affected because the impacts on agriculture. In fact, we have estimated for the major crops what is going to be the impact of a 1 degree increase in temperature, 2 degree increase in temperature, and so on. And overall, the net effect is going to be negative. Now, this is something that I'd like to highlight because this is going to be most prominent in those parts of the world where people essentially produce just about enough food to take care of their own needs. Now, if they're going to be affected by a decline in agricultural yields, then you can imagine that has very serious implications for both nutrition as well as hunger. So there will be undernutrition from reduced food production in poor regions, and there'll be increased risks from food and waterborne diseases. Now, what we really need is a combination of adaptation and mitigation, because we'll have to adapt to the impacts of climate change. There's, as I mentioned, a certain inertia in the system. There are time lags. Even if we were to bring about a radical reduction in emissions today, there is a certain inertia in the system, as a result of which for several decades climate change will continue. and the impacts will also, therefore, continue. And therefore, we have no choice but to adapt to a certain level of impacts of climate change. Since mitigation reduces the rate and magnitude of warming, it also increases the time available for adaptation to a particular level of climate change, potentially by several decades. What's also most important is that if we mitigate, then we can avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change. If we don't mitigate, then not only is there going to be a much faster rate at which these impacts will appear, but some of them, which perhaps could be eliminated, will be quite dominant. Now, in baseline scenarios, those without additional mitigation efforts, we found that direct CO2 emissions from the energy supply sector are expected to almost double or even triple by 2050 compared to 2010. So we're on a pathway by which emissions are increasing very rapidly, and this clearly is something that should impel us towards taking action and steps by which we reduce these emissions in the future. This results in significant increases in indirect emissions from electricity use in the buildings and industry sectors. You can imagine that with greater warming, there'll be a greater demand for air conditioning and space conditioning of various kinds. I also want to mention that infrastructure developments and long-lived products that lock societies into GHG-intensive emissions pathways may be difficult or very costly to change. An example is buildings. Now, this, of course, is a unique building which has been designed to ensure that you minimize the use of energy of various kinds, particularly fossil fuel-based energy. But on the other hand, there are a large number of buildings which have an economic life of 50, 60, sometimes many more years. In those cases, you really can't bring about any changes. Yes, there is some scope for retrofitting, but that will give you very small benefits in terms of reduced emissions. And therefore, it's important for us to design buildings at the initial stage itself which ensure high levels of efficiency. We'll have to lower global GHGs in 2050 than in 2010, 40 to 70% lower globally. Emission levels near 0 gigatons for CO2 equivalent or below in 2100. So basically what this is saying is that if we really want to limit temperature increase to, say, 2 degrees Celsius, and that involves reaching and maintaining levels no more than 450 parts per million of CO2 equivalent, then it's essential for us to start sucking in carbon dioxide before the end of this century. And that's not impossible. That's not something which is unreasonable. One of the things that we've highlighted is, as I mentioned earlier, forestry activities, reducing deforestation, reducing emissions from agriculture, and so on. The other thing that's very significant over here is the third item that's mentioned, tripling to nearly a quadrupling of the share of zero and low carbon energy supply from renewables by 2050. So we have 36 years in which to bring this about. Now, that won't happen by itself. We've got to put in place policies by which business, industry, and other stakeholders get very clear signals that they've got to invest in research and development and have to ensure the development and dissemination of some of these technologies. Nuclear energy, biomass, fossil energy with carbon capture and storage, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage by the year 2050 are the options that we have. And the IPCC doesn't do any policy prescriptive work, so we're not recommending one or the other, but these are available as choices for global society, and we'll have to exercise our choices based on what we perceive as best for a particular country. Now, if you look at technological opportunities, there are many scenarios by which you can reach 450, 500, or 550 parts per million of CO2 equivalent by 2100. But this would require availability and widespread deployment of bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and afforestation post-2050. So in other words, you could have overshoot scenarios. You could overshoot the 450 target that would stabilize temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. But then you'll have to take very stringent action and deploy technologies by which you can bring about a much more rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a whole range of trajectories or pathways that one can think of, but we must keep in mind the fact that if we allow delays to take place now, then clearly the costs of action subsequently will be substantially higher. So the availability and scale of these and other carbon reduction technologies are uncertain and associated with challenges and risks. Mitigation scenarios reaching around 450 parts per million CO2 equivalent concentrations by 2100 show large-scale global changes in the energy supply sector. Now, these would involve systemic and cross-sectoral mitigation strategies that are most cost-effective in cutting emissions than a focus on individual technologies and sectors. Just to give you an indication, I mean, you could have specific policies, let's say, for the transport sector, but that may or may not be as effective as, let's say, coming up with a price on carbon. Because when you do that, then that has a major impact not only on transport, it will have an impact on processes, on products, on technologies, all of which will be driven by this consideration of low carbon intensity. And at the energy system level, these include reductions in the emissions in intensity in the energy supply sector, a switch to low carbon energy carriers, reductions in energy demand in the end-use sectors without compromising development. So this is important. I think human society is certainly not going to bring about any of these actions by consigning us to a situation where we have to start living in caves and wrapping ourselves in sheepskin. I think basically we need to bring about a transition by which there's no radical change in those things that the world has become accustomed to. Although I should emphasize that lifestyle changes, behavioral changes are going to play a crucial role in the future. And what are these? Just to give you an example. If you look at Europe, I mean, you go to the Netherlands, you find everyone going around on a bicycle. And you've got excellent public transport. People go from one place to the other, 45 minutes away. They carry their bicycles with them. When they get off the train, they jump on their bike and they're off to wherever they have to go. Now, that's a major behavioral change. Similarly, I would say even the use of lighting in homes. And, you know, this is something that Michelle Addington taught me 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, in this country, there is obviously an excessive amount of lighting in several applications. Now, you therefore really need to come up with regulations that would make a difference. This is also true of the building sector. If there were local bodies that laid down benchmarks and laid down regulations by which buildings were made more efficient, then things would certainly move in the right direction. And reductions in energy demand in the end-use sectors without compromising development. Oh, sorry, I got that wrong. Now, this will give us more flexibility for reducing carbon intensity in the energy supply sector. If we were to reduce demand, then clearly we have a little more elbow room to bring about changes on the supply side. And hedge against related supply side risks. There are issues of energy security that we need to be conscious of. Avoid lock-in to carbon-intensive infrastructure. And these are, of course, are associated with important co-benefits. What are the co-benefits? Higher energy security, lower levels of pollution at the local level, protection of ecosystems, and so on. So these co-benefits, unfortunately, are not monetized, and perhaps some of them can't be monetized, but they're tangible, they're serious, and I think they have to be taken into account in policy formulation. Let me go through this quickly. Decarbonization of electricity generation for low-level stabilization scenarios. This will require renewables, nuclear, CCS, increase from 30% today to more than 80% by 2050. These are just some of the scenarios that we have put forward. Fossil fuel power generation without CCS is phased out almost entirely by 2100. So this is something that we see as part of the scenario by which you stabilize the climate. And RE technologies will take off in a big way. Nuclear could make an increasing contribution to low carbon energy supply, but there are barriers, there are risks which have to be taken into account. Replacement of current world average coal-fired power plants with modern, highly efficient natural gas combined cycle power plants or combined heat power plants. So the whole efficiency of this supply system will need to be altered substantially. I won't go into this, let me skip this. But here is something that might be of interest to you. This gives you some of the costs of mitigation. If, let's say, we were to bring about mitigation at the desired level to maintain temperature increase to 2 degrees or below, then we've estimated the loss in global consumption in 2030 would be a median value of 1.7% of the global GDP in 2030. In 2050, it'll be 3.4%. Now, if you look at it, this is really not a high price to pay for the benefits of avoiding some of the worst impacts of climate change, not to speak of the co-benefits which I referred to, which would accrue as a result. So anyone who says that the costs will be substantial is obviously ignoring this assessment and this reality. There's an increased focus on policies designed to integrate multiple objectives. So you really need to bring about improved energy efficiency and security, cleaner energy sources, air quality and human health. So these are just some of the core benefits associated with mitigation. And here I'd like to highlight something on which I've got a very brief film which I'll show you in a minute. The fact is that there's a large part of the world where you could use decentralized energy supply systems based on renewables. And there are these niche markets which actually amount to a substantial opportunity. You know, there are 1.3 billion people across the globe who have no access to electricity. And we can meet their demand in an efficient, clean way by using renewable energy. And here I'd like to mention two quotations from Gandhi. A technological society has two choices. First, it can wait until catastrophic failures expose systemic deficiencies, distortion, and self-deceptions. Or we could have a culture that provides social checks and balances to correct for systemic distortion prior to catastrophic failures. And the second quotation, basically, I mean, if we're just going to focus on GDP without looking at what the impacts are going to be, what the externalities are that we're burdening with all kinds of negative factors, then clearly that's of no value. That means speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. So I'll stop here and I'll request if that video could be played. That's just an indication of how one can bring about change at the grassroots level in some of the poor parts of the world. Thanks.
Do you want to take some questions from
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you. Well, while that's being loaded, I'll be very happy to take any brief questions that you have. Yes, sir.
Hello. Thank you for your talk and for your work. And I think what is probably the most important thing that one could be studying right now. A lot of us here are students and hopefully will enter the workforce in a couple of years. I'm curious from your perspective, where are we most needed? Like if we're going to have a chance at addressing the climate change issue you talk about, where should we be focusing our efforts?
Well, it seems to me this will be something that has to be addressed by all stakeholders. whether you talk of government, industry, civil society, research and academia, unless we have a coalition of all stakeholders, we're not going to be able to surmount this problem. So I would say, in my institute, we've set up a university called the Terry University. We have 2 MBA programs over there, and the focus of those is on sustainable development. There are some businesses that are getting very conscious about this fact and the need to move towards sustainable business. So I would say that there's a whole range of activities where if you have the right mindset, if you have the right skills, you really are going to be ahead of everybody else. Because whether it's 5 years or 10 years, I have no doubt in my mind that the world will be thinking along those lines. So my submission would be that depending on what your interests are, don't hesitate at all to pursue those interests, but do them within the framework of what would give us a better and cleaner world. Are we ready? Okay, let's play this. Can we switch off the lights? So the thing is, if we think out of the box, I'm sure we can find innovative ways by which we can harness renewable, low emissions technologies for a whole range of applications. in an economically viable way. Okay.
So we'll open up for questions.
No questions.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about future projections for monsoon change and what that means at a regional level with the low certainty in the data.
Yeah, in the Working Group 1 report, we have come up with projections on changes in the monsoon. Actually, it varies from across, all of South Asia. But one thing that's becoming common across the whole region is the fact that we'll have much more heavy falls than we've seen in the past. And that clearly has implications not only for safety, but also in terms of the amount of water that would be available. Because if the runoff is going to be much larger in short periods of time, then clearly what's recharged in terms of groundwater resources, what can be impounded and stored, would also have to be looked at. Now, one of the adaptation measures as far as the growing problem of water scarcity is concerned is much wider use of rainwater harvesting. And you would also need somewhat different infrastructure. That has implications for energy supply from hydroelectric projects as well, because the catchment area of these, if it's going to be affected by changes in rainfall patterns, then clearly that has implications for the kind of infrastructure you establish for producing power from hydroelectric stations.
Dr. Pachauri, shukriya again. This is really wonderful. So you had mentioned that the IPCC is not prescriptive in its endeavors. As climate change worsens, do you envision that role changing at all? And if so, in which direction?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last part of your question.
As climate change worsens, do you envision that role changing at all? If so, in which direction?
No, I don't think so. Because, frankly, it's bad enough for us to be accused of being policy prescriptive when we're not. Now, if we become policy prescriptive, then God help us. And so, and I think in order to maintain its neutrality, and I might just mention that the IPCC, of course, mobilizes the best scientific talent from all over the world. We don't pay them anything. People work as a labor of love, and they do it for the prestige, for the fact that they are contributing to something that has global implications. And I think one of the reasons why, despite all the reservations that people have in accepting the findings of our assessments, is the fact that there is a certain level of neutrality that people see the IPCC associated with. Now, if we were to change that, firstly, it's going to be very difficult to come up with policy prescriptive suggestions because they'll vary from place to place. And there's really nothing that you can put forward as a silver bullet. There are problems, there are opportunities with everything that we do. So I don't see the role of the IPCC changing. It's going to remain policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive.
Thank you, Dr. Pachauri. So these wonderful, magnificent works by IPCC that are presented in these reports are unfortunately very dense and very academic or difficult to understand for the general public. What is, in your opinion, the most effective way to convey the challenges to the general public so that we can get a very effective change from the entire population?
Well, firstly, each assessment report has a summary for policymakers, which is supposed to be written in simple, intelligible language. Perhaps that's not always possible, but I want to tell you that every summary for policymakers has to be accepted by all the governments who are sitting in that room for almost a week, sometimes through the nights, going through every word of the text that's presented. And often most often the kind of response you get from the country delegations is, why are you saying this? And then the authors have to defend why. And then they say, okay, I understand now, but why don't you put it in somewhat different language? Because my minister won't understand what you're saying over here. So we do modify the language. But despite that, frankly, a lot of technical jargon does remain over there. Now, it's for this reason that we bring out something called the synthesis report, which will be coming out in October. And that's a very slim document, and that also has a summary for policymakers. Despite that, I mean, I should be candid that it's not something that you would get the manager of a 7-Eleven store to understand. I mean, the highest respect that I have for 7-Eleven stores, because they bail you out when you need them the most. But the truth is that they probably are not meant for people who have a certain level of education, which is certainly not something to be negligent of. But I think there what we really need is partnerships. And that involves the media, that involves NGOs, that involves a whole lot of organizations who can take the findings of the IPCC reports and convert them into language that most people will understand. Now, that's something the IPCC can't do by definition, but others can. And we're trying much more this time around to see that we engage people to take our message, convert it into something that people will understand, even school kids. I mean, you need books that are illustrative, that are simple for school kids to understand, because you've got to cater to every section of society, including the next generation.
Thank you, Dr. Pachauri. It's always great to see Mahatma Gandhi reinterpreted in your presentations as we see these challenges go forward. My question to you is...
Maybe I hope he's blessing me wherever he is. Because most people have forgotten him, and I think he was a man ahead of his time.
Following that point, do you see the role, how do you see the role of developing countries, per se, in taking lead in reducing the impacts of climate change, or for that matter, even showing the path for solving this problem?
Well, I'm increasingly of the view that the developing countries have to sort of take the lead. It would be utterly foolish. I mean, you've seen the little film that I presented. You could have these people in villages wait till they get an extension of the grid, wires coming into their homes, and that'll probably take another 3 generations before they can get reliable and regular supply of power. But on the other hand, you can jumpstart the whole business and use technologies that are now on the horizon. So I think we need to think out of the box. We need to think differently. And I'm sorry, you probably heard this quote before. When Gandhi was asked whether he wouldn't want India to be as prosperous as Britain, his answer was, it took Britain to use half the resources of this planet to reach its level of prosperity. He said, how many planets would a country like India require? And that's the point. I mean, why should we follow a resource-intensive path of development? I mean, China is 1.4 billion people. India is getting there and will probably surpass it very soon, because we don't have the one-child norm. And, people are pretty productive, at least in expanding the population. And therefore, we really cannot pursue the same path of development. It would be utterly foolish to replicate what's happened in the rest of the world. However, let me tell you, when you talk to the leadership in our part of the world, they say, why should we be denied all the good things of development? Well, we have a certain culture, we have a tradition, we've got thousands of years of history. Let's build on that and make the most of the opportunities that we have.
Thank you. As climate change, the effects of climate change start being felt, and we move from mitigation to adaptation, is there any worry that countries will start looking within themselves for resilience and maybe give up on the mitigation route and just pursue adaptation within their own local regions?
No, we've made it very, very clear that it can't be one or the other. It has to be both, because if, in the Working Group 2 report, we brought out very clearly that you would reach a level of impacts of climate change when adaptation will just not work. There'll be certain thresholds, there'll be certain tipping points beyond which adaptation will be extremely challenging. So I think countries will have to pursue a path of both adapting and mitigating. Nothing short of that is going to work. And I think that's a message which comes out very clearly in the 5th assessment report. I see the president of the university here, so maybe I should shut up. Yeah. Mark, over to you.
Stay here. All right, so let me introduce Peter Salovey, the president of Yale University. He has a few remarks.
So good afternoon, everybody. I hope the day has been an interesting one for you. I wish I could have been here to see it, but I did want to come for the end of this afternoon because on behalf of the whole university, we wanted to take a moment to honor Patchy, who has been a terrific partner for several years. Let me tell you the story. I think some of you know it and others of you may not. The Climate and Energy Institute really started as a faculty project in 2007. And the idea was an institute devoted to research and teaching on issues at the intersection of climate, energy science. Came together really through, it kind of grew up organically, came about through faculty like Dave Bercovici and Mark Pagani, getting their colleagues excited about potentially collaborative, first sharing of ideas and then maybe research. But you may remember, those of you who are Yaleys, that in 2008, the next June, Dr. Pachauri was honored with an honorary degree at Yale. And so many of us who knew him by reputation actually got to meet him on that occasion. And on that occasion, we read a citation about him. And I'll read it to you now. It's very brief. As a leading voice on climate change, you've been a builder of bridges from scientific evidence to public policy, from developed to developing countries. As author of one of the first major reports on global warming, you helped lay the foundation for the Kyoto Protocols of 1997. And as a leader of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you have brought the world's scientific community together to sound the alarm about the future of our planet. You combine a deep respect for science with passion to protect our environment. Yale is privileged to have you as a collaborator with our School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and pleased to award you the degree of Doctor of Humane Letters. That was the 2008 interaction. Now, people up here in forestry already knew Dr. Pachauri, but that was when the rest of us really got a chance to meet him. So in 2009, I think President Levin got the great idea that why not have Dr. Pachauri and this fledgling YCEI institute intersect each other. And Dr. Pachauri was named the first director of YCEI. And we appointed him as professor in the practice of sustainable development up here in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And for the next several years, as you know, he has split his time between Terry and Delhi, where he's been the Director General since 1981, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which he's chaired since 2002, and us. And I think, which is a handful, no doubt about it. I think you know Terry, since 1981, is India's most prominent center for research and education in the field of sustainable development, but really is a global institution. So when we looked at the years, while Dr. Pachauri has been the director of YCEI, we can see the accomplishments of the group. Seed grants have been given for scholarly research. The postdoctoral fellowship program began. Very robust set of workshops and speakers, and of course the annual conference. Since 2012, he's remained on the faculty steering committee for YCEI and become the senior advisor to YCEI's external advisory board. Let me give you some of the accomplishments in just a little bit more detail. Those seed grants have involved $2 million, 20 projects, 50 faculty members, 15 different Yale departments. I think many of you know how hard that is to do. There's also been more than $5 million in external funding from NSF, from Department of Energy, and other sources. There have been 18 different postdocs from 13 different universities. They've worked in 9 departments and schools at Yale. There have been 5 annual conferences. There have been 12 workshops and forums. The Energy Science Institute out on the West Campus was established and funded by a very generous gift, and is generally thought to be an outgrowth of YCEI, and now has a nice collaborative partnership with YCEI. Over the next period of time, we'll be drafting a report on what is needed over on this campus in the area of sustainability. And I know Dr. Pachauri's ideas are going to influence us as we think about the Northeast, as we think about Connecticut, as we think about New Haven, and how Yale needs to respond. I think YCEI, many of you have heard me talk about a more unified Yale, right? That's one of my themes of the new presidency. And I always use YCEI as an example of a more unified Yale that predates anything I had to say on the topic, right? It is a wonderful example of faculty coming together from all parts of the university and to do collaborative research and teaching and to influence practice. And I think that has happened in large part because of the inspiration and the leadership that Dr. Pachauri has provided. So to show the university's appreciation, we have a little gift for you. And does anybody have that gift? Is that, there it is, okay. Now, this is subtle. Okay, what is this? Right, a hockey stick. Why is this? Right, we all know the famous graph. But this is more than just a analog representation of those data on climate change. But it is also a souvenir from the NCAA national champion Yale hockey team, who last year were #1 in the country. It is signed by President Levin, by me, by our hockey coach, but also by the founding members of YCEI, who may never have played hockey in their life, but recognize recognize the challenge that global warming presents to ice hockey. So what is now happening is this hockey stick is actually being circulated in the climate change community for additional signatures, and in fact is on its way to Michael Mann. And I think many of you know Michael Mann is the person who did that research, whose hockey stick shaped data on global temperature rise were just so influential in getting people like me, psychologists who don't work in this field, to recognize what a serious problem climate change, in fact, is going to be. So we will lend this to you for the purposes of this ceremony, then take it back from you, get the rest of the signatures, and then ship it to you. But Patchy, thank you so much for all that you've done for us. Thank you so much. Great. That's good. Thank you. Thank you so much.